But when worlds collide, said George Powell to his bride, I'm gonna give you some terrible thrills, like science fiction, double feature.
Now with the Showman out of the way, I can get to where he led me. And where he led me was into my first pen and paper game. Something that I remember very fondly. Even though, much like the Showman, my first appearance was kind of a mess. And the campaign itself suffered from a few issues. It also contains the moment where I realized I was here forever, and that I was going to be playing pen and paper games for the rest of my life if I had any choice in it. Now, saying all of that, I know I'm going to get looks for what's coming next. But please, have a bit of humor and bear with me. Okay, so, sometime in the middle of writing The Showman, my German engineer friend came to me with a question. He wanted to know if I had any interest in pen and paper RPGs at all. And honestly, at that point, even though I'd never played one, I always liked the idea. After all, video games owe a lot to pen and paper games. So, in a way, they descended from them. And even if you don't play pen and paper games, you always hear these ridiculous stories about what comes out of these games. Hell, TG is as much made of web server and page as it is barbarians killing people by rolling natural 20s and throwing their own brains at them. So I always wanted to be a part of this fucking nonsense. And I have been, but we'll get to those stories. So I said yes, I did have interest, and sensing I might be invited to one right now, I urged him to go on. Then he asked me another question, and in hindsight, this is probably one of the most important decisions of my life, on par with moving out of my mother's house. He asked me, would you like to play Necronica? Well, my answer was, of course, what's Necronica? Since at that point I had yet to be as deep into weeb shit as I am right now. And to the rest of you that know... But for those of you who don't know, and I didn't at the time, Necronica the Long Sequel is a game where you play an undead anime girl and try not to go insane. If you follow the half-translated book to the letter, the setting typically contains a world that has been through the apocalypse. Be it plague, war, aliens, what have you. The players assume the role of, as I said, undead anime girls, referred to as dolls, who are risen again from their depths by a mysterious figure known as the Necromancer, who is whoever the hell the GM decides who it is. Again, if you follow the book to the letter, the Necromancer raises the dolls and gives each of them an express task that they must carry out. This is what's known as their karma. In the stereotypical situation, the dolls have free will, but are bound to this task. To make matters worse for the zombie waifus, they all have collective amnesia, and can't really remember anything about their past, aside from a few fragments of memory, which you roll for during character creation, and it's up to the GM to fit them into the campaign somewhere. Since, in addition to their karma, the hunt for their lost memories takes up a large portion of the game, which can form plot or character arcs depending on how clever the GM is. To make matters better, or worse, upon their resurrection, the Necromancer equips these dolls, obviously to ensure that they complete their karma. In addition to equipping some of them with basic simple weapons, the Necromancer, or the resurrection process itself, also warps some of the dolls' forms, which take the form of striking and sometimes grotesque mutations, such as hardened skin that can deflect bullets, claws, extra eyeballs, that kind of thing, as well as a number of artificial enhancements such as robot arms, jetpacks, artificially boosted reflexes, all the way up to making them a straight-up cyborg. However, all of these modifications and alterations to a little girl are completely up to the player themselves during character creation. In addition to this, with dolls being zombies, they're also incredibly durable. Each doll is made up of a set number of parts, sectioned off into head, body, legs, and arms. Each individual part is essentially a hit point, and dolls can lose entire limbs and basically be fine. But, as you can imagine, this entire situation puts a lot of stress on the human mind, and the dolls themselves are very vulnerable to going stark raving mad at any moment, which is why extended instances of combat, as well as seeing and witnessing all of the horrible things out there in the world after it's gone through the apocalypse, gains you what's known as madness or insanity points. And each doll only has so much capacity for these points. If the doll's capacity is completely filled, they go insane. And to make the situation even more grim, the rulebook then specifically states that if this happens, the player loses control of their character and must hand them over to the GM, which, predictably, all sorts of horrible shit can happen then. So in a world ravaged by whatever flavor of apocalypse the GM decides on, death isn't your only threat, and the player must be keenly aware of how much insanity and madness is brewing up inside their character. But all is not completely hopeless. There are ways to manage and regulate your insanity. And you do this by being a cute anime girl and doing cute anime girl things. You see, how one keeps track of all of the madness that their doll is accumulating is through the use of what's known as fetters. These essentially act as storage tanks for containing and repressing the madness. Each fetter is assigned to a specific person. Usually this is one of the doll's sisters, the other dolls, aka the other players, and is a representation of their relationship with that person. However, they can also be assigned to NPC characters. Each fetter can contain a maximum of 4 madness points, and dolls start with 1 free fetter for each member of the party, as well as one that is specifically dedicated to what's known as the doll's personal treasure, which you decide on during character creation, which usually takes the form of a girly object such as a locket, necklace, and even a small zombified pet if you get really creative. So when something traumatic happens and you incur a madness point from it, it goes into one of these fetters. But hang on, this is where the fun starts. You don't simply go insane all at once. It comes in stages. You see, each fetter has a specific quality, aside from the treasure one, and this represents the character's attitude towards this specific person. Whether they are friendly or dislike this character, have a running rivalry going, or rely on this character for emotional support, or to blow the doors completely off the hinges, straight up in love with them. Yes, and the dolls are all supposed to be girls. When a fetter accumulates all 4 madness points that it can possibly contain, it enters what's known as a state of madness, in which case the darker, extreme end of this relationship is forced to come out. And these have effects in combat. For example, if you have the hateful fetter, which is to say you don't like this person, the state of madness for that fetter is called open hostility, in which, in combat, if you miss an attack, the attack actually hits the target of the fetter. Whoops! Sorry about that. You fucking bitch. Another example is called attached, where for whatever reason you feel emotionally bonded to this character and never want to leave their side. The state of madness for that is called relentless observation, in which case during combat your character gets really creepy about this whole attachment thing, and the target of the fetter takes 2 madness points, one at the beginning of combat and one at the end of combat, presumably because your character spent the entirety of combat breathing heavily down her neck and sniffing her hair. Fucking weirdo. One of the most disturbing states of madness is actually tagged onto one of the most innocuous fetters. Friendly. That state of madness is called inordinate empathy. In which case, if the target of the fetter has sustained damage, for instance, lost an arm, your character decides to be nice and self-mutilate herself so this person doesn't seem out of place, and breaks the same number of parts the target has broken. My god, what would happen if they developed a complex about not having an arm? But then again, you're fucking crazy, so anything goes. Obviously, despite the potential for crazy anime antics, entering a state of madness on any of these fetters is usually pretty bad. But like I said, there's ways to manage this. And the most common and easy is simply making a conversation check, where you pull yourself aside and have a bit of girl time with any of your sisters. You roll 1 10-sided dice, and if you succeed the roll, i.e. roll higher than 5, you get to remove 1 madness point from any one of your fetters. And if the GM is nice, any number of cute things can constitute a check like this, even if they aren't conversations, which means you'll lose a madness point for it. This kind of thing is actually a pretty stereotypical part of most Japanese pen and paper games. It's to help autistic shut-ins who can't socialize roleplay their anime girls. And I know some of you who take themselves way too seriously are looking at this game and wondering, wow, those are the only people who play this game. That are some kind of weird lolicon pedophile. And yeah, if I'm going to continue being completely honest with all of you, in the back of my mind I was kind of hesitant about this, not wanting to be called a weeb or a permavirgin. But I still said yes.
So you've got a big afternoon planned, huh? Why don't you have a seat right there, please?
Now wait, let me explain. Mr. Hansen, she told me she was a 2,000-year-old vampire goddess. Yes, I know, they all say that. Forgive me, I was just a weak-willed man that was lured in by a succubus. But in all seriousness, it's not really that bad. Frankly, the problem with this, and most role-playing games, is the fact that people take themselves way too fucking seriously. We all know what an overindulgent weeb looks like, and no, nobody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to be that guy. Even the people who watch anime don't want to be that guy. So most of us exercise restraint in our hobbies. Like anyone else. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with cute girls doing cute things. Even better when all of this is played straight and tied into a decent story. Which is what I got. Because unbeknownst to me at the time, I was about to walk headfirst into a role-playing group full of writers. People who knew their shit, and they knew how to make a serious story. As anyone who actually plays role-playing games will know, you can make something serious out of anything, if you're up to the task. You could make something cutesy and completely innocuous into something gripping and emotionally powerful. You could make Sailor Moon after the English dub, or you could make Madoka Magica. Or you could make something that was intended to be dead serious, completely hilarious. It's all down to what you want and how good of a writer you are. For example, Warhammer 40k, and then Warhammer 40k from the Orc's perspective. So yes, to state the obvious, Necronica could be played like a 4-koma or a one-shot daytime anime. But if you have a good GM and a good group, you could play it as Apocalypse Now with anime girls. And doesn't that sound interesting? Yeah, I know, overly grimdark can be just as bad as overly saccharine. And lately, anime has a really bad public image. There's a lot that separates your normal bullshit television anime from something like Grave of the Fireflies. But what I'm saying is, there's more than meets the eye here if you work hard enough. And my German engineer friend did a pretty good job of blowing through the wall here. Remember, I told you he was good at making doors. If I can recall properly, there were 4 main reasons why this was so easy to walk into for me. The biggest one, of course, was he was going to be the GM. He was going to be running the game. And at this point, I trusted this guy. Hell, I trusted him even more after this. And I still trust him to this day, even though we have our moments. Hell, this campaign had a few moments. And because he was the GM, he could do certain things to make the situation for me a bit easier. And one of those things was he said I could play a dude if I wanted to, which flies completely in the face of what Necronica is trying to accomplish. However, it made it easier for me to walk into. The third thing he told me was I was going to be playing with 2 girls. Through text. So you could imagine how this made some certain things easier. And it would later turn out that meeting these 2 would be very, very important for me. I can say completely without exaggeration that meeting both of them was as important as meeting my German engineer friend in the first place. They kept the self-improvement train that I've been riding on track, and in some cases made it even better. They became some of the best friends that I ever had. They were both writers. One of them was an artist to boot, though that one doesn't talk very much. Regardless, they both fell into roles of mentors for me, and eventually, thanks to their nearly infinite good nature, they fostered my creativity and helped me move forward. But I didn't know any of that yet. What really got my attention was the story. In the stereotypical Necronica setting, one of the most important questions you have to ask is, well, how did the world end? Why is everything so fucked up to the point where most of civilization is gone and horrible mutant zombies roam the earth? You know, in addition to all the other things that are trying to kill the little girls. And actually, depending on your style of storytelling, you don't actually have to give a direct answer to this question. Necronica, by its own nature, and maybe because it's half-translated, leaves this completely up to you. And in some cases, because it has that one-shotty 4-koma feel, it actually encourages you not to go into this into too much detail, to maintain the mystery surrounding the entire setting. And to keep the door open for basically whatever fucking creative reason you come up with. It's one of the main reasons I actually do like Necronica. Basically, if you can come up with a reason to stuff little girls into it, you can make it work. The system itself is that open. However, people who play role-playing games don't really need to be told this. As I found out, a really good group basically does whatever the fuck they want. The only unifying feature is they take the system's rule set into account, and use it as a rough form of governance. But even then, that's not set in stone either. If the GM or the players feel that a certain part of the system is encumbering, they can choose to ignore it. Though of course everyone has to agree on this, which is why I got to play a dude and it didn't break the whole game. But more or less, when you sit down to play a role-playing game with an experienced group, you're only limited by your imagination and your appetite for random chance. It also helps if you have an appreciation for dramatic tension and theatrics. An important thing to remember is, kind of like Door Fortress, losing can be fun. And winning all of the time isn't necessarily the best outcome to the situation, or at least not the most entertaining. But let's get back to the question at hand. So, how did this world end? According to my German engineer friend, he took the majority of inspiration for this campaign from a short film on YouTube called Fortress, which is a CGI indie film by Dima Fedotov. I'll put a link down there. It's a science fiction film, in which, 10 years after the war that ravaged the world and destroyed humanity broke out, the redundant automated systems that humanity made to help them fight the war are still fighting it. Far long after the lives of the human operators have been extinguished and the war itself has lost all context. The film itself centers around a lone nuclear bomber, which has since become a coffin for its crew, continues to carry out sorties over enemy territory, completely on autopilot and following predetermined instructions. At one point, an adversary fighter attempts to intercept it, its pilot also long dead, but the automated turrets of the bomber knock it down. leaving it to continue its completely pointless mission, and drop nuclear warheads on fortifications that have long since been completely destroyed. It's a very strange, lovey kind of film, with obviously a strong anti-nuclear message. And despite the clearly sci-fi artistic liberties it takes, it's actually a pretty good representation of what we almost did during the Cold War. I recommend going into a bit of Wikipedia dumpster diving, and then looking up details on the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE project. We actually really weren't that far off. And in a way, it's kind of sobering to think about that. And my German engineer friend wanted to put little anime girls in this kind of situation, where they would explore this hostile and ruined world in search of their memories, all the while encountering unspeakable horrors left behind from the war, and in some cases being pursued by the most dangerous of them all. Military vehicles and hardware which was dangerous in their heyday, but now have been left to virtually their own devices to carry out their singular goal, to destroy the enemy and win the war. A war which no longer had any meaning, and an enemy that could be reasoned to be anyone. In a sense, these humble pieces of military technology began to take on the forms of mythical beasts and monsters of fairy tales and legends. And one way or another, the dolls were going to have to overcome all of them, if they stood any chance at surviving, reclaiming their memories, and maybe bringing an end to this mindless destruction. Upon hearing all of this, I had the predictable reaction. Dude! That's fucking awesome! Yes, if you know me, I'm a huge fucking nerd for military technology. And all of this shit hit me right in the autism. And the thought of all of it nearly swept me off my goddamn feet. In addition to Fortress, he also mentioned that he took inspiration from Metro 2033. Jesus, this keeps getting better and better. However, he hadn't quite figured it all out, so we talked a bit. A pattern which continued throughout the entire game. I didn't know all the secrets of the game, and in hindsight, I knew jack shit about it. But to say we weren't furiously shaking hands underneath the table the entire way through would be lying. However, there were some communication issues and crippling disconnects that would come up later in the game. And unfortunately, not all of the ideas that were stated did actually come up, for a lot of reasons. But we'll get to those points in time. Before the game actually started, me and him talked really broad shop over the constraints of the war, because this is my autism just as much as it is his. Then we came up with the most simplistic setup ever. Quantity and quality. One side favored the very high-tech approach, and this is the side that resulted in the automated drones, and the other favored more biological steps, which resulted in mutants and zombies, whose efforts eventually led to the dolls. Though it's not as, how should I put this? Regimented and clear-cut as that. The highlights of this were, from Team Test Tube, mindless zombie soldiers and a giant crab monster with a howitzer. From Team Technical Superiority, an AI-controlled P-47 which flew around and harassed the party for most of the game, which I suggested and my friend agreed on the name of Pendulum, likening the torture device to ground attack strafing runs. See? I can be clever. Waiting in the wings, but never had a chance to show up for a multitude of reasons that we'll get to, was an automated tank that we decided on the name of Jaeger for, which is German for hunter. And also way back in the cliff notes was something similar to the trauma suit from Fallout. Watching Fortress and using your imagination, you could probably figure out how these units were supposed to work. And it was more than enough to get me over the general awkwardness of saying, I'm going to be playing Necronica. Even though there are some things about Necronica the Weeb sequel that I've been skipping over that I should probably stop and highlight for you. The first one is, while I respect the person who made this as an artist, he's got fucking problems. And secondly, if you go off diligently searching, you'll probably find the sample replay. And I should note several things about this replay. One, it's out of date and outright lies about certain game mechanics. And two, there's no womb part. It doesn't exist. So we can all calm the fuck down. Most people who play Necronica caution people to not read that, because it can cause unnecessary confusion and it fucking goes places. Places that the game in question might and probably will not go. Because every GM is different, every player is different, and every story is different. No two pen and paper campaigns are ever going to go quite the same way. And most of them, in fact, do not visit the mythical meadows of Magical Realm. It's just that the ones that do are so hilarious or cringeworthy, people talk about them a lot. Just like planes don't always crash and ships don't always sink, but boy do we love to fucking talk about those. Personally, that's why I'm paranoid about elevators and escalators. So, you got the point that I'm trying to make here? You picking up what I'm putting down? Congratulations then, you're in on the joke. Nearly everyone keeps this shit at arm's length, and we giggle about it in a dark corner somewhere. Now you can look like a normal TG user. And now that I've fed you the good humor bar, we can get back on task. Because now we get to talk about how the hell I made my character. And his name is Stanley.
At the starting of the week, at Summit Talks you'll hear them speak. It's only Monday. Negotiations breaking down. See those leaders start to frown. It's sword and gun day. Tomorrow never comes until it's too late.
This song is called The 6-Day War by Colonel Bagshot. It's actually a very important song for Stanley because it's how I thought of his backstory. Even though, yes, I know, dolls aren't supposed to have memories, so we're not supposed to know our own backstories. But for a lot of reasons, the exercise wasn't completely pointless, and in some cases it's actually pretty good that I did it. We'll get to that. Now, jamming a dude into a Necronica setting, coming from the people who attempted to write the Showman into MG&Q, shouldn't be all that surprising, but it really isn't hard to do. However, my approach to this problem would be very different. Though, in my mind, I see connections for what Stanley eventually evolved into, and some ideas and feelings that I had behind Marlowe's Saint in his origin story. There wasn't room for the Showman here, of course. The impression about the game that I got was we were going to be playing a fairly low power level, very serious game, the darker edge of this setting being pretty apparent. The time frame and aesthetics of the game were going to be, roughly, modern day, or at least I thought. And from what I knew of my German engineer friend at the time, he was a very serious guy, so I didn't expect it to be very outlandish either. Ha 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 ha. Oh boy, was I wrong. However, as I know from the opinions of the other players in that game, this was about the same interpretation they took from it as well. So it wasn't us. I'll explain these points when we get to them. But for now, back to Stanley. From the outset, considering the darker tone of the game, I got serious. And maybe a little bit too grimdark. At the beginning, before Stanley and Colonel Bagshot entered the picture, I read through the Necronica PDF and my eyes caught the flamethrower, also the jetpack. Quite frankly, the armaments, mutations, and enhancements go from reasonably mundane to incredibly anime. But these two parts got my attention, and so my mind began to work. And eventually, what I came up with was a character that looked like the Pyro from TF2 or the Fury from Metal Gear Solid 3. Yes, the mind that brought you the Showman also likes the Fury and the Fat Man from the Metal Gear Solid series. This shouldn't be terribly surprising. Now, I know you're probably looking at me funny after I said I got serious and this is what I came up with. And this is partially why Major Tom here did not get clearance from ground control. Although nobody said I couldn't play him, I just canned him myself because I thought I could do better. However, I would come back to this character later. But this wasn't an open-shut operation, these ideas kept going. The first thing I ripped off was the jetpack, because that was just too ridiculous. So he started to be more pyro. He wore a gas mask, was kind of somber, didn't really talk much, kind of a stoic-looking character. In this little transitional period, I discovered Colonel Bagshot. And even though I liked the line in the 6-Day War, 1,000 candles burn around, as symbolism for the flamethrower was also next. And so this brought me back to step 0 again. I didn't really have any very good ideas. So, I meditated over the 6-Day War for a while, and I began to stitch together a backstory for this character, where he was living a normal, a bit reclusive life, when suddenly the war broke out. After narrowly escaping the opening shots, he found himself living in a nuclear fallout shelter, where things were pretty bleak. And of course, since Necronica involves the undead, things will get the most bleak that they possibly could.
Think tomorrow's come, I think it's too late.
However, I didn't stop there. This, as of yet unnamed character, which would become Stanley in time, was slated to be in a situation where he was surrounded on all sides by anime girls. And while at this point I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing, I was still frantically working through this backstory in the hopes that I would come up with some kind of idea. At that point, in a manner of speaking, the knife slipped into my hand. The metaphorical blade of drama. I gave him a dead sister. Because of course he was going to be in a situation where he could project this onto multiple people, and even though he couldn't completely remember it, it would color his attitude. And the specific way it would color his attitude came to me when I was selecting a class for him. You see, in Necronica, there are a number of classes along with positions, which are basically mental states. How a doll sees themselves and their perspective on the situation that they're currently in. The classes, on the other hand, are more physical things, your choice of which directly influences the amount and type of parts you're going to be able to pick up during character creation, as well as having skills which determine what you're proficient in. For example, melee weapons, guns, and also diverge into mutative qualities, such as being able to regenerate yourself, and robotic as well. And among these classes is one that's specifically designed for defense. In your standard RPG fare, it's referred to as the tank. The person who is supposed to stand out in front, draw all of the attention so all the other squishy allies don't get shot. In Necronica, this class is referred to as a Stacy, who are a class of dolls who are specifically intended to be the durable guardians of their sisters, and as such are equipped with skills that can negate damage and also block incoming attacks for their sisters, by using their own bodies as a shield. Which I looked at and thought to myself, well, wouldn't the male version of that be Stanley? And that's how he got his name. So what began to take shape in front of me was an explosively tragic character, who in life had failed to protect himself and his sister, and now upon becoming one of the undead, would try again, with his new sisters. If this wasn't depressing enough for you, at about this time, I found the Beach Boys. And not, well, the happy-go-lucky Beach Boys, their later stuff. That shit is depressing. And once again, another song came up for Stanley, when I accidentally stepped in the waist-deep puddle that is the Smile Sessions. And with the initial groundwork that the 6-Day War gave me, I used this as fuel to write the rest of the backstory. Now you're gonna see how my brain works again. I'm going to summarize, of course, but I'm going to summarize it through using the song. That kaleidoscope into alternate realities thing, basically what I do is I concentrate really hard on the lyrics and twist their meanings. I use that as a basis and then invent the story around it. I will now demonstrate. The song is called Surf's Up, and the part that I used is from about the middle of it.
Dove-nested towers, the hour was strike, the street, quicksilver moon.
Night had fallen over the capital city. Stanley's sister had dragged him out all day. Now they were on their way home. Everything was calm and peaceful.
Carriage across the fog.
They were on a bus. Stanley's sister had since fallen asleep on his arm. She was energetic, but she had her limits. There was a thick fog blanketing the city that night. The bus driver was taking it slow.
To step to lamplight cellar tune.
Then, abruptly, the entire bus was shook by something. The bus came to an abrupt stop, jolting Stanley's sister out of her sleep and Stanley out of his current indifference. A moment later, the fog was blasted away from the windows, and they saw the skyline of the city on fire. That was the night the war began. It started off conventional enough. Strategic bombing. So the bus driver hurriedly let everyone out. There was a shelter not too far away. This was the capital of all places. While Stanley, his sister, and a lot of other people never thought they'd go to war, some people had prepared for this. And so the two of them ran, and made their way down to the shelter.
The laughs come hard in Auld Lang Syne.
They were there for a while, through Christmas and through New Year's. The shelter itself was state-of-the-art. However, because of that, it had locked itself down when it detected chemical agents in the atmosphere above. The conventional bombing didn't stay conventional for very long. And it didn't let up. To make matters worse, no one inside really knew what was going on up there. But they tried to make the best of things. Stanley really didn't know what to do with himself, but his sister was a very productive person. always ready to help people. Though neither she nor Stanley really knew what they were going to do. They weren't able to get in contact with their parents, and, well, it's safe to say they were on their own for the moment.
The glass was raised to fire and rose the fullness of the wine, the dim last toasting.
Then things got quiet for a little while. The bombing campaign seemed to have ceased, and then suddenly the door to the shelter spun open, and in walked a large group of men, armed, wearing urban camouflage, and all wearing gas masks. Despite their imposing presence, this was actually a relief. They were the army, and they had brought supplies with them, and also good news. Valentine's Day, they said. The war would be over by Valentine's Day. Stanley didn't know what to think, but everyone else simply broke out into celebration. They then lauded these men as heroes. Their saviors. Not really caring to ask for too many details.
Why let poor Adu die?
In the midst of their celebration, the leader of these men stepped forward. He kept his gas mask on, not wanting to look any of them in the face. Then, he proceeded to essentially read them their death warrant. That, effective immediately, all able-bodied men and women were to submit to compulsory conscription. This order came down directly from the government, and refusal to comply with this order was to be met with summary execution. Upon the end of this announcement, all the soldiers in the room proceeded to bare their arms, seeming as if the action was rehearsed, like they had done this before. Everyone abruptly went dead silent, but then the shelter started to shake, more violently than it ever did. Parts of the ceiling began to collapse. The bombing campaign had abruptly resumed, or maybe it was something else. Everyone inside, the soldiers, Stanley, all ran for their lives. But upon reaching the entrance to the shelter, Stanley realized that he was alone. His sister was nowhere to be found. But he knew she would have waited for him. To make matters worse, ahead and above him, some of the other people that were in the bunker made their escape, and their shouts and yelling were abruptly silenced by gunfire. Stanley froze on the spot. She couldn't be up there. No. The shelter itself had stopped shaking at this point, for the most part. So he went back inside to look for her. When the leader of the soldiers had given their announcement, they had all been arranged in the common room. So Stanley thought she must be there. And so he ran, trying not to trip over the debris and trying to ignore the pools of blood on the floor, left by the unlucky or just a bit too slow. He turned the corner to the common room, which had mostly been collapsed at this point. There's one single light source, a lamp from the ceiling that was now dangling around precariously. Dust was hanging in the air, and Stanley was exhausted and trying not to cough as he called out for his sister. And a moment later, he heard her, calling out to him while pinned under the debris. Stanley tried to pull her out, but he lost his grip and toppled back onto the floor. He looked down at his hand then. It was coated in blood. He had just another moment to look back at his sister, her face frozen in terror. She screamed his name as the last light in the room went out. And then the ceiling collapsed, entombing the both of them.
A choke of grief, hard-hardened I, beyond belief, a broken man too tough to cry.
Cut! Are you depressed yet? I fucking was. That's what happens when you give me the tragedy ball. I fucking run with it. Although, the text file detailing all of this is about as well off quality-wise as, well, the Showman's death. His first one. And I'm completely aware, despite the dramatic airs I put on for everything, it's probably not that good. Although, the two people that I showed it to actually did like it. One was my German engineer friend himself, the GM, and another one was one of the girls that I'll be playing with. Though that was after the game. But she's important. We'll get to her. You know, when I start talking about the actual fucking game. Jesus Christ, I've been going on for half an hour. But yes, despite what I said about being better, at this point in my life, I was still pretty depressed internally. And I dove into that black shit. Which is not inherently bad, because this is a fairly compelling idea. And it stuck with me immediately. However, I did say my first appearance was a mess on par with the Showman, didn't I? Some additional things to note about Stanley. After I selected him to be a Stacy, the idea hit me by way of the Gundam Thunderbolt model kits, specifically the Gym, to give him robot parts. What was to become his signature were 2 robotic arms sprouting from his back, holding 2 very large slabs of metal, makeshift shields, so that he could do his job. His primary weapon was a shotgun because it was fairly easy to use, because it gives a +1 bonus to all attack rolls. Necronica is a D10 system. For those of you who don't know, that means the vast majority of things are solved with a 10-sided dice. So in effect, this gave him an extra 10% chance to hit his targets. Sturdy and reliable. His position was junk, which is basically the mindset of, wow, everything is fucking terrible, but I'm still gonna try anyway. And his treasure was a pair of headphones. He had a thing for music, like the dipshit that wrote him. And as he came together at the end, my mental image of him took the form of something like a very sullen-looking hairy champ from Zoids crossed with Greed from Fullmetal Alchemist. Though I'm not exactly sure how that mental image happened. It wasn't really something that I intended, but it just kind of stuck. Short brown spiky hair, brown eyes, and a red hoodie. Despite this characterization that I've just thrown at you, I know it lacks a whole lot of specifics. And that's mainly because I didn't know anything about the world again and was writing in the dark. It was all supposed to be a surprise. And even though I had some sort of information going into this, we were going to learn about the majority of the world as we played. And even though all of that work actually got me to the finalized character that I was able to play, it was all, in the normal sense, unnecessary. I didn't need this big of a wind-up. Even though in some cases putting this kind of detail into a character is actually a very good thing. Something I learned much later on is the fact that until you actually put things down on the page, all of the details are liquid. Everything can be changed at a moment's notice, right up until you actually start talking about it. Then you're stuck with it. If you're a good writer, of course. If you're a bad writer, it comes off as incomprehensible. So despite all of the plans you put in beforehand, a better option is to not play to them terribly hard until you actually have to, because no plan survives contact with the enemy, and Stanley's didn't. However, as General Patton said, planning is essential, but plans are useless. The organization part of the planning gives you structure and gives you direction, tells you where to go. From that point on, it's down to complete chance. And oftentimes, things do not go to plan. So in some cases, preparing this elaborate backstory beforehand was actually hindering as much as it was helpful. Due to a communication error, we started with an original sin built into Stanley. One that would, make my life incredibly difficult. And also make Stanley's characterization a complete fucking train wreck. At least to me at the time. To this day, everybody seems to like Stanley. Even though, aside from a few very bright moments, he was not the character I intended. In hindsight, though, my struggles also highlighted a very big flaw in this campaign. It had to do with what I thought of for that last line that I played from Surf's Up, which began to form a bridge between Stanley and the Necromancer, the person who raised him back up from the dead in order to accomplish this mission, and his intent behind making him. Essentially, the idea was that the Necromancer had fucked with Stanley's head a little bit, which would make him see things in not quite the right light. Not exactly pyrovision, but it would certainly dampen some of the instances of extreme violence which were to follow in his job. So he'd be reasonably okay with acting like a human cutting board to defend the horrible monsters that were his sisters. We'll get to them. As I was confronted with later, and I completely agree with, it was a complete cop-out on my part. However, reflecting back on it now, this kind of behavior modification wasn't actually out of place in the game. But in my case, it was a band-aid that I used to cover for my complete incompetence and inexperience in roleplay, which was completely normal at that point. When you try something new, chances are you're gonna suck at it. The only thing that I'm guilty of was attempting to cover for that and make sure the thing went smoothly. However, I will swear to this day, and take the fact to my grave, that it was agreed upon before we started. My defense is, I think all of my ideas are shit, so I never would have ran it somewhere where it was going to be public if it wasn't agreed upon by someone else. Ha! See? My logic is flawless. However, when I had the rug pulled out from under me later, as I scrabbled around for something to cover this hole with, in talking with the GM about it, I began to notice certain flaws in his logic. Some of which revolved around the Necromancer. Before we started, what I didn't realize was, he wasn't going to be around for very long. And even though he was trumped up as a central character in this story, his lasting reach, or really his impact at all, along with a lot of other things in the campaign that really should have been paid attention to, wasn't a very big concern. This game had another first. Because unbeknownst to me at the time, and only made apparent until well after we started, this was also my friend's first time in the GM seat. And next time, we're going to be going through the game itself. Because I realized after going through all of this, even though I hold this game very dearly, despite the problems with it and Stanley, all of my plans and expectations stood at very, very stark contrast to the game itself. It really was like I was watching two roughly similar movies that were completely different.
Like a science fiction double feature. Dr. X will build a creature. See androids fighting me. Brad and Janet and Francis stars in Forbidden Planet. After late night double feature picture show, I wanna go. To the late night double feature picture show by RKO. To the late night double feature picture show in the back row. To the late night double feature picture show.
Is it done, Yuri?
No, Comrade Premier. It has only begun.